This is the new global high table. Our task is to find a way to realign, to align the G20 in a world that is changing even as we speak. This is, in a sense, this is the only table with the 20 most consequential countries of the world that have gathered and do gather every year, and is probably becoming more consequential as traditional multilateral systems find themselves in a bind, find themselves paralyzed. And I will begin with my first question to Mr. Borrell. So how can a grouping like the G20, which is traditionally driven by, which started as after the first global financial crisis of 2008 and is generally seen to be an economic grouping, how do we give it strategic direction? How do we make it more relevant to today? How will you make it more relevant to today?
The G20 has a special responsibility with respect to the international community. It's 70% of the world population and I think 85% of the GNP. So certainly it has a strength and a capacity to deal with global problems. But the G20 exists in the world the way it is. And in this world, everybody is preaching multilateralism, everybody's in favor, but in practical terms, not so much. There are few practitioners. And we found inside the G20 the same fault lines that we found in other forums, in other institutions. And it is because in the world today, we have a reality and two tendencies. The reality is the power politics is coming back, and a strong decomposition and fighting. This is reality. And this reality, it's in the middle of two tendencies, two big events. One is the China-US competition, which is going to be the big strategic forces of this century, and it's going to increase. And the second one is the fact that there is not a multilateralism, but it is multipolar world, and there is not consensus. And when there is not consensus, it's difficult to look for solutions. Nevertheless, we need to look for them. And the G20, it's one of the few forums where everybody can present their proposals and to try to look for something that breaks this lack of consensus. But I don't believe on miracles. And I know perfectly that the vote in UNGA, then when you come to the G20, we have more or less the same mirror. Because the lack of consensus of the international community, the lack of consensus cannot be solved just by gathering together 20 instead of almost 200. So I think that the G20 has a specific role to play. It is not longer an economic forum. It has become a geopolitical forum, and it has to try to build multilateral approaches in a world where what do we have is not multilateralism, but multipolarity. And this multipolarity here in India is easily to understand why it happens. Because there are many countries around the world that they don't want to be put on a set and have to follow orders or have to follow political consigna or ideological alignment. They have their own point of view, they have their own interest, they want to be heard, They have grievances from the past, they have identities to develop, and they want to be heard with dignity, and then it comes this idea of the global south representing a lot of people who doesn't want to be aligned one side or the other in the middle of the war in Ukraine. And this kind of multipolarity has to be understood the way it is, accepted, because it represents a new approach to the world problems, and we have to deal with it.
Could it be, Mr. Borrell, that consensus has often been used as a way for, as an excuse for non-action in traditional forums? You search for consensus, you don't get it, everybody doesn't sign on, nothing happens. As we look at the current fault lines in geopolitics, can we go beyond consensus? Can we look at taking decisions based, say, on majority or a voting, and not the veto?
Don't tell me I am in charge of building the foreign policy of the European Union.
Yes, that's why.
Dealing with 27 member states, which have to decide by unanimity, and theoretically they are very much like-minded members. They are much like-minded, and I know how difficult it is to have common positions when this has to be decided by unanimity. I am very much in favor of majority rules, but I wonder really who is the one who is ready to renounce to their veto right on the Security Council. Do you know someone?
And that brings me to Marcelo. You spoke about G20 direction, the potential, the possibility of G20 being the forum where we can break the deadlock that we see in traditional systems. How does G20 then become redefined?
Well, I would like to say that in the first place, if you see the multilateral architecture that we have already, currently, with the geopolitical tensions that we are passing through, the current situation can be described as a paralysis in expansion in the multilateral system, with many risks. So G20, from my point of view, has a very high level of value for the international community from our point of view, because it's the only table space when you have 20 leaders once per year. And they should discuss the things, the issues, right now, the war even, geopolitical issues, and other issues. And there is a principle of accountability too. It's the only day that you have everyone there. 8% of the GDP. Representation from other countries too. But you need to explain what are you doing. Why we cannot take some decisions? Why you oppose certain decisions? Why are you promoting a military solution for each issue or another issue? So I think there's a high value to expand, to strengthen the G20 conversations. We cannot expect the G20 by itself solve the conflicts that we are facing, because you explained it just a minute ago. There are no rules for majority, there are no global governance institution. It's just a consensus and dialogue space or occasion or table, which is very important for the rest of the world. So I think that it's very valuable from this point of view. And what can be our strategy in the next months and years? Perseverance. Difficult to reach consensus. We are going to face a high level of tension in the next months and years. This is the reality. But we need to make a perseverance strategy in order to at least maintain communication between us and promote an explanation of the decisions of each one in front of the public opinion worldwide. So I think that this is the Mexico point of view right now about G20 and the possibilities.
Interesting that you said that, and the importance of having to explain G20's decisions and the conversations. But do you believe that the G20 could have implementing authority? I mean, executing authority. Can you envisage a G20 which comes out of a room, but then takes those decisions out on the street? Is that possible?
Everything is settled in this direction. It depends on our ability, our political ability, and the possibilities that we have already in order to reduce conflicts or try to look for solutions. Even in the Ukraine-Russia war right now, G20, it's an obligation for everyone to explain what are you doing? What are you doing this or that? Why are you against peace settlement? Why are you against the dialogue possibilities in the short term? And it's very costly not to have a very clear position about this when you have 20 leaders and a global attention on your discussions and your positions. So there are a political limit about each of the parts of the G20 decisions. And this limit, I think, is some sort of public opinion, global one. You cannot lose the public opinion and want to maintain your decisions without any support from the public opinion global-wide. So that's why it's so valuable. Well, we were in the Security Council past year. It's a paralysis every day. There are no global attention anymore to the Security Council as you have in G20. So it's a great opportunity, the only one that we have right now. I think so.
Thank you. Melanie, if I can come to you. Do your conversations in the G20, do they reflect the fault lines that we've all talked about? Or is there an attempt to find a solution, find a way forward?
Well, it's good to see you again, Indrani. We got to...
Yes, indeed.
I was here 3 weeks ago. That's why I guess you call me Melanie.
That's right.
And you call these folks by their last name.
Quite
it's
right.
great to be with you, Marcello and Josep. I'm happy to be here. I think that clearly the big fault line right now is the invasion by Russia of its neighbor, which we all know has violated the UN Charter and has created the biggest security threat since the Second World War. And the conflict could be resolved very quickly. And as I said to Sergei Lavrov yesterday, Russia needs to get out of Ukraine, period. Now, the G20 was created, and Marcello and Josep referred to it, on the basis of economic partnership. It was to create more economic growth. It was to create economic opportunities in many countries, including here in India. But it is very difficult to create economic opportunities when there is a security risk. Business is allergic to risk. As a former businesswoman, I understand that we always try to mitigate risks. And so, therefore, it is very difficult to address these issues of creating economic growth while at the same time there's a war raging in Europe. Now, we hear and we know that the Global South is frustrated with the fact that this insecurity has created effects across the board, because there were already crises beforehand. The climate change crisis was already there. The COVID-19 pandemic had impacted many, many countries. And of course, now we know that there's food insecurity, energy insecurity. And so that's why, Indrani, the G20, and a lapsus G19, is important because we need to address these crises meanwhile. And I think India is doing a good job to address the question of debt and the access to capital of many countries, the question also of development, and everything linked to climate change, because these crises will continue, and we need to step up to the plate and deliver for our generations and also the next one.
Thank you for that, and thank you for referring to your previous visit, Melanie, which brings me, which was actually if I may say so, very important visit, because you launched your Indo-Pacific strategy in India 3 weeks ago.
Yep.
And it's a strategy which I know you had a personal hand in drafting. How, for Canada itself, how is your Indo-Pacific strategy aligning with your priorities for the G20?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, we love Europe. We've been historically invested a lot with Europe. We're part of the G7, part of NATO, and we'll always continue to look to the East for us. At the same time, we're very much integrated with North America. We have part of NAFTA. I get to see Marcello many times per year, always a pleasure. And at the same time, we need to look west, because Asia for us is west. And we need to become a more reliable partner, as we are a nation of the Pacific as well. And so we have also a very strong relationship with India. We have 1.8 million Canadians of Indian origin. We can definitely invest even more in that relationship. And so in that sense, I think that the strategy that we brought to the table is linked to what we heard in the Indo-Pacific, the needs, infrastructure, tackling climate change, the question also of free trade and having much more investments. And these are all things linked to the G20. You know, Canada we're fortunate enough to be at the G7 table, like I mentioned, but also part of the Commonwealth, like India, of Francophonie as well. And what we're hearing at these different tables are the same things we're hearing also at the G20. And I think that indeed there is an existential crisis affecting multilateralism right now, Indrani. But I think we can't take for granted our institutions that we've created over the past 75 years and that have kept us relatively safe since the Second World War. So you can count on Canada to be at the table, to address these concerns, and at the same time to continue to engage and voice our preoccupation and our disagreement. But I think engaging for the sake of engaging is actually very important, particularly now.
Thank you. Shahryar, you will be the voice of the South that we all hear, the global South. You're looking at a war that you were not a part of, that is in another part of the world, yet you're feeling the consequences. We in the global South are feeling the consequences of this war. As you come in as one of the big observer countries to G20, what are your expectations? What are your expectations from this new high table of G20?
Thank you. I think it was, we are grateful to the Presidency India for inviting Bangladesh, and my Prime Minister is scheduled to attend the summit here come September. And it's a very effective one, I hope, as well, because there's a disconnect between North and South. Some of the speakers mentioned Global South, appreciate their thoughts. But we are so far behind. The big issues like the war is impacting everyone, but they have much greater ability to cope and sail through the rough water. But we have very limited resources. Our challenges are much more fundamental. Whenever Sheikh Hasina, Narendra Modi, and other leaders of the region gets together, they keep on mentioning poverty. That's very fundamental. We struggle to feed our last 20% of our, in our case, 170 million, in your case, 1.4 billion, and same applies for many other countries. I mean, in the neighborhood situation are worsening by minute in other SAARC countries. I know we love to talk about the big things, and yes, we need a solution, but there are so many other ones which are relatively low-hanging, and not enough attentions are being paid and not enough resources are being mobilized. In our neighborhood, we have an issue in Myanmar. A country like Bangladesh, yes, we have just recently graduated, which is fantastic, but up until recently, we were one of the poorest. It's a middle-income country now. We are aspiring to be a higher-income country by 2041. But we are having to host 1.2 million people. That requires nearly $1 billion a year to look after them. When we get, and among the OECD member states, with all due respect, they promised ages ago that they will be contributing 0.7% of the GDP for the LDC countries. Up until recently, in last 50 years or so, only 4 complied. Everyone, the other countries actually failed to deliver the commitment. Now, even for Rohingyas, $1 billion that is needed, this year we have only raised 60% of it. Where the rest 40 is going to come, we can't let them starve. So we, from our pocket, need to spend the remainder of the expenses that is needed. And there are so many other cost elements that is not included in the budget, which is nearly accounting for $2 billion that Bangladesh is having to spend, and it's only Bangladesh. Now, I don't think for that issue, Myanmar, many of the countries present here today or in the global north handheld Myanmar into democracy. But that democratic leader miserably failed. And the only thing that we see, some targeted sanction among individuals who hardly goes out of Myanmar and hardly travels and hardly have any thing to do with any other country. And there were reports came out in the British media recently, the number of companies who benefited and milking money out of Myanmar till today, when the crisis is still at its peak. Now, having said that, the other low-hanging ones are, well, the war is so huge problem that we are having to term the other one relatively easy, which is not, with all due respect. European Union has done fantastic work, keep the climate agenda as a priority, even though some of the major member had a lack of continuity in their policy. And it's European Union-led initiative to bring loss and damage onto the table. And this is something we are desperate for. My Prime Minister Hasina has led the Climate Vulnerable Forum, 53 member countries who are emitting a lot less, but unfortunately on the receiving end of it. And Delhi, Dhaka, we know the climate, the air quality and everything else, don't want to talk about it now. But there are so many other, on technology transfers, have we done enough? Probably not, between South and North. On climate change, not enough. Supporting the grassroots level poverty alleviation, yes, there are some trade tools that we have received, and some of the countries use those successfully, some of them failed to do that. Bangladesh is probably a glaring example, exporting and the RMG sector brought the change, the 5 million people, mostly women, that relates to women empowerment as well. So I think this is an opportunity for us. India is a current presidency. The next one is going to go to Brazil and South Africa. Afterwards. So it's going to remain in the South, and time can be any better than now and next 3 years to bridge the gap between North and the South. And I think global North needs to do a lot more than what they're doing. Now, if I may at all, it's well above my weight limit, is I think what needs to change, we have been talking about the reform at the UN.
I was going to ask.
India today is the world's largest country in terms of population. What voice you have? Your voice is no louder than the country of 100,000 inhabitants. Of course, there are important, you get to lead the committee, you sometimes you get to win the election relatively easily, or not easy, but yeah, of course you are seen differently. But your vote is as good as the vote of a country of 100,000. It's unfair. And the world has changed in the last 70, 75 years. There are new economies, important ones, someone who has delivered or done well. So I think UN reform needs to be top priority agenda. Otherwise, you'll never get to pass through those resolutions. It's never going to get it through. G20, of course, probably you have your issues there. But European Union is a fantastic model. Of course, this is based on consensus and a lot of hard work, as Mr. Borrell went on to mention. But I think UN reform should be the first one, a top priority agenda at the global level.
So that's interesting that you said that, because you answered my second question before I asked you. But and I'm going to go back to Marcelo for this, because you spoke about UN reform, and as he observed, the UN is paralyzed. So UN reform cannot be expected by people, by the countries that have contributed to its paralysis. So my question to you is, today I'm going to put you all on the mat because I need solutions. We are in a part of the world, we're looking for a way out. We're looking for a way forward, and we believe the G20 can deliver. So if you had to prioritize, we understand that G20 cannot solve every problem under the sun, but if you had to prioritize, where would we start? Where should we start?
I have an idea.
Good.
Well, obviously, we need to work very hard in order to try to avoid the disaster that we see that is going to come in the Russia-Ukraine situation right now, because everyone says, well, the Russians are preparing a new offensive. Maybe Borrell can share some comments on that. But the first issue here is to avoid a great catastrophe, prolong the war, to have a disaster there as far as we can do it. Obviously, this is a geopolitical urgence. The other issue is how to avoid the paralysis in the G20. So we don't have consensus, obviously, about this. But do we have other consensus in other issues or not? Is there going to be some consensus this year or not? So the struggle is to have G20 taking some consensus about other issues, not only this one, regarding the comments made by my colleague from Bangladesh, and to try to demonstrate that we can deliver in other issues at the same time that we are trying to close the possibility to a great disaster in Ukraine situation. So I think that this is the map that we face right now. And we need to look and make all political efforts in order to reach this point. Because if we allow the G20 to replicate the Security Council situation, so what are we going to do?
Correct.
To have what? To have different groups? To have a frozen multilateral system? So the only way that I see is this one, to try to go forward as far as we can with the G20 this year.
I know, Melanie, you have an answer to this. Give me one.
I think there's two aspects to your question. The first one is multilateralism can work. And we just had an example last December in Montreal in Canada. We co-hosted with China, which Canada doesn't have the strongest bilateral relationship with China, particularly right now, with the strong allegations of foreign interference in our elections. So we we were able to get to a consensus at COP15 of protecting 30% of biodiversity by 2030. So it is possible to get there. And I think this was, on the biodiversity front, a Paris moment on the climate change front. So I think we can be very proud of that work, and it shows that it is possible, even when two states don't see eye to eye, to get to a consensus in a context of multilateralism. So that's my first point. My second point is the paralysis that is affecting, particularly right now, the Security Council is linked to the war in Ukraine. And more countries in the world send a clear message to Russia, more will be able to isolate politically, diplomatically, Russia, and therefore create a movement to ultimately get Russia out of Ukraine. And to send a clear message to China also, that it is important that ultimately it does not support Russia in its violation of the UN Charter. And I think that we saw through the G20 that 18 countries were in favor of an approach, and there was 2 dissenting countries. And India said these are the 2 countries, China and Russia, dissented. And that's movement diplomatically. I think this is something we need to recognize, that was, yes, indeed, there was no joint press release, but at the same time, for India to say that Russia and China were the only ones not reaching a consensus is a message in itself. And so that's why I think that more we're putting diplomatic pressure, more we'll get to a place which eventually, I hope we can solve, which is basically Russia getting out of Ukraine, and then we'll be able to address the question of the UN Security Council and therefore a greater reform of the UN. But until then, it is very difficult to do so.
Mr. Borrell, I'm going to, you do live for consensus, because that's, as you said, you have to get a foreign policy consensus from 27 countries, which is part of your daily job. One of the things that we've seen with something like the Quad is they don't always obviously agree on everything, but they move forward with in areas that they do agree and park the ones that they don't agree for a later date. Is that something that the G20 could adopt? And if it can, what would you prioritize? What would you say should be the top 2 areas that we should go for?
Now look, I think that we should concentrate on making work what do we already have. Because certainly it's good to talk about the reform of a multilateral system and institutions, but it's not going to come tomorrow. And I am quite skeptical about the possibility of doing a deep reform. Why don't we concentrate our efforts on making things that we already have to work? For example, climate change. We said that $100,000 million would be allocated to help the poor countries in the world to adapt to climate change. Why don't we concentrate on making this pledge reality? And I can say that because we at the European Union, we did our part, because we have allocated 26 billion euros to that. Why the world doesn't concentrate the efforts on making things that has already been agreed to be implemented? Because sometimes we make big agreements that they are never implemented. And second, multilateralism needs rules, order. If someone breaks the rules blatantly, you cannot expect multilateralism work. And it has been a blatant break of the international rules order with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And as far as international community doesn't condemn unanimously this blatant violation of the rules, we cannot continue preaching multilateralism. It's a contradiction. So please, everybody who is abstaining by several and different reasons, they have to understand that we are facing something that breaks the possibility of having a world consensus and work together in order to face global challenges. And I understand perfectly the collateral consequences of the war against the poor people around the world. I understand perfectly. And we try to mitigate it as much as we can. But look at who are the guilty for this. Who is the one who created the problem? Why we are talking so much about the lack of fertilizers in the world? Why? Because someone started a war and broke down the flows of fertilizers around the world. And we can look for solutions which will be second-rank, suboptimal solutions. The root causes of the problem has to be dealt with. And certainly here at the G20, we found the same fault line that we found on the Security Council and in the General Assembly of the United Nations. This is the thing that has to be addressed directly, openly. And I understand people from the so-called Global South that said, like, look, I cannot bear the consequences of this war. Certainly not. So we stop this war, yes, but how do we stop this war? I know how can I stop the war. If I stop supporting Ukraine military, the war will stop. But how? Don't you care? Don't you care about how the war will stop? And this is the question that I address to everybody that preaches to stop the war. Yes, okay, how? And which will be the consequences? And this question is being avoided, I'm sorry to say. There is no answer to this question.
And that is a question I will ask Shahryar. From the Global South definitely feels the consequences, the implications of this war more than any other part of the world. How, if you had to speak for the South, how should we stop the war? The war has to be stopped, as you said. How should we? What would be your contribution to a global forum that says that yes, we need to stop the war because we need our lives back to what it was?
I know you are desperate for an answer here, but you know, it's if it is difficult for them, it's impossible for me. But you know, in multilateral forum, we say we stand in that great podium of GA and we make big statements and large promises for a rule-based global order, do away with poverty, better cooperation. But in reality, no matter whether we have an influence over a relatively militarily and economically stronger countries, you know, the acceptability of those statements are going to diminish. And in some cases, or in many cases, they are diminishing at a faster pace than ever before. And there will be a point, you know, I absolutely hate to mention this, is we will lose trust on these multilateral forums. But as I said, we are hopeful, and that will keep us only going. And our aspirations, which we are desperate for, and the reason we need a multilateral successful forum like G20 and G7, and in our region, let's say the other ones like ASEAN and SAARC, which is not doing great though, but we still have hopes, is that we need to invest a lot more to get things done unless we have a reasonably effective multilateral forum. And you do not necessarily need to, or you will be able to solve all the problems. But the one that can be achieved and solved are the one that should be targeted, and take it from there one by one. I think that should be the approach for us.
Thank you, Shahryar. I'm going to now open it up for questions from the audience. I will first go to the Raisina Young Fellows, if they have any questions. Could you identify yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Stephanie. I'm from the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK. So you've talked a bit about UN reform, but there has been a lot of criticism that the G20 has not delivered since the 2008 financial crisis, and the forum has expanded in many ways, but that it is not more effective. Do you think that the G20 needs to be reformed? And if so, what would that reform look like?
How and how do you get there? Who will take this question?
I think it needs to work.
Go ahead.
And I agree with what Joseph said a bit earlier. We need to make sure that the institutions we have work. And so in that sense, I think that's what, I think Indonesia did a good job in a very difficult time last year. They were between a rock and a hard place. I think India is in that same type of position. Well, there's been precedents that were created last year. And so in that sense, I really think that before looking at the question of reforming G20, we need to make sure that we work together to ensure that India's presidency this year is a success, and India can count on Canada for that.
Okay, quickly, and then I will go to... Yeah.
Thank you, Your Excellencies. Owen McSweeney is my name. I'm Irish and I work at the UN in New York. In response to your criticism of inaction on Myanmar beyond sanctions, I'd be interested to know, what do you see as the potential for further action 2 years on from the coup? So my question is, individually, perhaps collectively, what are we not doing that we could be doing, bearing in mind China's veto at the Security Council?
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to take more than one question because we don't have too much time. Can you identify yourself,
yes,
please?
Absolutely. Patrick Kugiel, Polish Institute of International Affairs. I would like to build on the previous question regarding the reform of the G20 and put it bluntly and straightforward. Why can't you suspend Russia as a member of the G20 and then move forward and continue on solving the current problems of the world? Whether you don't need to have a procedures and processes and mechanism to suspend members which are violating international law and UN Charter.
Thank you. So a question on Myanmar, Sharia for Sharia, but a bigger question on whether African Union should be a member of G20, and why can you not suspend Russia from G20? So you take that. Joseph.
Well, you cannot say that you want to push for multilateralism and then ask for Russia to go out of the G20. It's quite contradictory, no? I think that we have to keep ways of talking, or at least listening. If not talking, at least listening to the others. And to tell the truth, in the G20 meetings, on the G7, on the G20, we listen to each other. This G20 meeting has been a strong improvement with respect to the G20 at Bali, because at Bali, Minister Lavrov came, talked, and left. He didn't stay to hear the others. At least this time, he stayed and he listened.
That's progress.
And this is a small improvement, but it's important that we can say whatever we think and to receive the answer from the other side. And we have to keep this possibility. At least this is a small possibility. I don't see the advantage of saying, no, frankly speaking, it's not a lot, because it's not a lot of interactivity, but at least he came, he listened to us, we talked to him, he answered, and I think it's better than nothing.
Thank you. That is wise words. Shahryar, how do you...
Thank you. I mean, one of the worry in case of our issue, the Myanmar, we thought it's losing traction and world is not, keeping enough attention. But, I'm glad that some young minds asking questions on this. Is something that went out of hand, UN, United States, European Union, handheld Aung San Suu Kyi into democracy. But, she's the one who miserably failed. And it was during her tenure the crisis started. And she was in a denial mode. At the ICJ, she accompanied the military rulers to defend the Tatmadaw, which is an absolute shame. But we are not insisting for sanctions. As a country, we do not believe that sanction works. We also know that Myanmar is a poor country. We don't want the people to suffer. But the companies who are dealing with government, they are the one, the newspaper report that I referred to that published the report that, companies in the West are in business with the Myanmar government. I think that needs to stop. That's something that they should have stopped ages ago, but it's probably a little too late.
Thank you. We are almost out of time, but I'm going to just give 30 seconds for closing thoughts.
There was African Union.
And the African Union? Yes, the African Union.
Well, so we believe that the African Union should have a permanent seat at the G20. Many countries have mentioned that. We think it's an important message. And also, we commend India for bringing the question of debt financing in the context of this G20, because one thing that we can get to reform is actually the reform of the international financial institutions. And if we don't do that, many countries, and I think, for example, in our hemisphere, the Caribbeans, or I was with the head of the African Union, Comores, yesterday, they're facing a triple crisis, which is definitely the impact of climate change, the fact that they are, because of COVID-19 restrictions, many of their industry, particularly the tourism industry, was affected, and therefore they could not have enough revenues generated within their countries, and also non-access to capital through international institutions. So more we're able to address this, more we'll be able to help also solve one of the big issues of the Global South.
Excellent, and that's one of the big should be one of the big priorities of G20. I'm going to ask the others, Mr. Borrell, what would you say should be the big priorities for G20 today?
The big priority for G20 today is to try to stop this war. There is not another one for the world. If we don't stop this war, we will be suffering very bad consequences, not only in Ukraine, who will pay the higher price, not only in Europe, but the whole world, because the next food crisis, the next energy crisis will put the world in a very dire economic situation. So there is not other priority than this one.
Excellent. Marcelo.
I agree on that, but we need to advance in other issues too, because otherwise we are going to have a paralysis similar to the Security Council. So there are several agreements taken by G20 which we need to deliver in the short term. This is the opportunity this year to do it. For instance, we have an agreement about 14 countries right now are paying very high rate to the International Monetary Fund. Very, very high. Argentina and other little ones, or mediums. But nothing happens. We've taken this agreement a year ago. So there are several issues, very important, already agreed on, as you mentioned, that should be presented this year in the G20 here in India, with results, with advances, with some sort of action. Other way, the impression is that, well, we have another Security Council here. It's just about declarations, which is important, but we need to deliver something else. I think that we have this opportunity this year, despite the difficulties and the extreme difficulty which is the war in Ukraine. But as far as I can see, we can defend G20 as a global dialogue space which is finding some answers to the situation right now. Otherwise, we are going to lose this one too.
Thank you. Shariat.
I think India's presidency in G20 can be better utilized, and of course there are agendas, and that was disclosed kind of end of last year when the presidency was announced or taken over. But as far as the war is concerned, there's very few countries who are talking to Russia. I think as the presidency of G20, I think India have a much greater chance to bring them to the table and find a possible solution and bring an end to the world.
On that note, thank you very much for
Thank you,
an
Indrani.
absolutely fantastic panel. And if G20 replaces the UN Security Council, we started it here.